For coming out on what is a dark and cold autumn evening, nearly winter. Very good to see you here. Let me tell you a little bit about what this evening is. We're putting on a debate between Jim Rickards and Anne Pettitfor. And the genesis of this event was a discussion that Anne and Jim had on Twitter earlier this year. About a pretty fundamental question, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard or read people talk about before, which is the question of whether or not gold is money. Now, obviously, a platform like Twitter, which limits you to only 140 characters at a time, probably isn't the best medium in which to have such an in-depth discussion. So what they did is they put the debate on pause and agreed to debate in person the next time Jim was in London, and, well, here we are. Now, tonight's debate is called The Future of the International Monetary System, Gold, SDRs, or More of the Same. And if you're wondering what SDRs are, well, you're going to find out. It's a big subject, obviously, and while it would be nice to think that we might arrive at some definitive watertight conclusions by the end of this evening, we do only have around 90 minutes, so there may be one or two loose ends hanging by the time we get to the end. The format of tonight's debate is very simple. Each of our speakers will present an opening statement. After that, there'll be an exchange of views. I'll be wearing my metaphorical United Nations blue helmet and trying to keep the peace and moderate. And if you have a question during the debate, then do make a mental note of it, because we'll have some time towards the end for questions from the audience. Before we start, can I, just to get a feel for the room and who's here, can I have, by a show of hands, who came along tonight because of Anne? Because of Anne. Because Anne has been promoting it, and I've been promoting it on behalf of Jim as well. And who came along because of Jim? Right. Okay. It's worth knowing. It's worth knowing. I'll tell you a little bit about the speakers tonight. We're still waiting on Anne. I think London traffic has struck again. But obviously we didn't want to keep you guys waiting because you've all come out tonight. Just a little bit of background about our speakers. Anne Pettitfor is Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics, otherwise known as PRIME, and you can find that at primeeconomics.org. She was one of the few economists to correctly predict the global financial crisis before it happened. For example, back in 2003, she edited a report which argued that debt and deflation would be the legacy of globalization, while in 2006, she published The Coming First World Debt Crisis, which turned out to be a very timely look at the problems of indebtedness in OECD economies. Anne is also well known for leading a campaign that resulted in over $100 billion of debt owed by the poorest countries in the world being cancelled by the IMF, the World Bank, and the Paris Club. She also advised the Nigerian government when $30 billion was cleared at the Paris Club in 2005. She's a member of Labour's Economic Advisory Committee and the author of The Production of Money: How to Break the Power of the Bankers, which is due to be published by Verso in February next year. Our other speaker tonight is Jim Rickards. Jim is an investment advisor, lawyer, and economist, and has held senior positions at Citibank, Long-Term Capital Management, and the hedge fund Caxton Associates. He's the editor of the financial newsletter Strategic Intelligence and director of the James Rickards Project, an inquiry into the complex dynamics of geopolitics and global capital. His books include 3 New York Times bestsellers, Currency Wars, The Death of Money, and the newly published The Road to Ruin, which Jim is going to be signing after the debate. Away from writing, Jim is an advisor on capital markets to the US intelligence community and the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and is on the advisory board of the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance in Washington, D.C.
I'm really sorry. I nearly got crushed to death at home.
No, no.
So I'm very glad to... Oh, wow, what a wonderful
You
crowd,
missed your
Jim.
introduction, but that's it. Well,
Good.
thanks.
Phew. Sorry about that, everybody. Yeah.
Glad you could come. Was it traffic or?
Is it someone's fallen on their line?
Oh,
Either
God.
that or there was frost on the ground last night. I'm not quite sure
Right.
which of those two.
Yes, that's London Transport. Okay, so as I say, the format of the debate, we're going to start with an opening statement of around 10 minutes from each of our speakers. Jim, do you want to go first?
Well, I think we had scheduled
Oh.
Anne first. We were
Yeah.
Okay.
improvised a
Me
little
too,
bit, but
yes.
Anne's...
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yep. So
Okay.
you want me to go? Right, I'm ready.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Jim and to Ali for organising this. It's really wonderful to have such a packed meeting, a place about this debate, which is all about money, and just shows how much of a hunger there is for understanding of how the system works. So I'm really honoured to be here. And I have to recommend that you read Jim's book. I disagree with a large part of it, but it's absolutely riveting stuff, really. From an insider, and actually it's helped me to strengthen some of my arguments against him. So that's why I think you ought to read it. Anyway, so the question was, what is the future of the monetary system? Well, you will have seen the Bank of England's financial stability report today, and it's enough to give anyone the heebie-jeebies. The future of the global financial system, monetary system, is in very dire straits, and we've known that. We've known that for some time now, but the Bank of England is beginning to panic volubly. It's been panicking behind the scenes for some time. The OECD and the IMF, all the big institutions, the Bank for International Settlements have been panicking, but the world has been allowed to go on as if everything's hunky-dory. But it isn't at all. Today, the bank's stress test for the banks said, what are you going to do in the event of a severe, synchronized UK and global recession with associated shocks to the financial market prices? Well, we know that one bank already, the biggest, the one that cost us the most, RBS, has been deemed unready. So this is terrifying, really. And there are little signals of how wrong things are. On the 7th of October, sterling depreciated around 9% against the US dollar in just 40 seconds. It was a kind of flash crash. But it's a hint of when things go wrong, they're going to go wrong within seconds, not just within minutes or days. So the big story for London, as you all know, is property prices and how high they are and how unattainable they are for most of Londoners. But there were 13,500 properties worth more than £1 million put on the market the last month, and 233, only 233 of them sold. So there's 13,000 and only 233. So we can be sure that we've now tipped the top of the property bubble here in London, and it's beginning to burst. And the same, of course, has happened to commercial real estate, which has fallen by 2.6% since the Brexit referendum. Now, the reason that's important isn't just because people are going to lose a lot of money as their properties devalue. It's important because it's collateral for additional financing. It's collateral for many companies for getting more money, probably for raising more funds to pay off old debts. So when the collateral shrinks, the amount of money they can raise shrinks too. But we've known this for long, and Jim mentions in his book the report of 2014 from the Geneva Group about the scale of debt. What is so extraordinary about what's happened since the crisis is that nothing has happened. Nothing has changed. Structurally, the global financial system, monetary system, remains exactly as it was. And as a result, if you look at the report from the Geneva Group, the chart just does this. It just goes up, and it's now 210% of global GDP, a hell of a lot more of what it was than in 2007. So what we've had is a massive private debt bubble, not a public debt bubble. Some of it's been transferred to public balance sheets. A private debt bubble that hasn't burst. It's still out there. It's still a massive bubble. But the problem is, while we eased up, and we didn't ease up a lot here in Britain, we still owe 130% of GDP in debt. 130% of our income is owed in debt. We're not going to pay that back, by the way. It's not going to get paid back. But it's still very high, and it's dipped a little bit since 2007, but it's where it was in 2005. Now, that would be scary enough, but pay in Britain is where it was in 2005, i.e. it's still very low. And how do you repay debt? You either inflate it away, you write it off, or you pay it down. And of course, the best thing for creditors, for financiers, is that you pay it down. But if your income shrinks, if your pay shrinks, you can't pay down your debts. And that's really what's happening. The reason why this private debt bubble hasn't burst and hasn't been brought down and been delevered is because there's not enough money to pay it down. So we know about debt. It's subject to the laws of mathematics rather than physics. Unlike wealth, which is subject to the laws of thermodynamics, and perhaps gold is an exception to Jim, debts do not rot with old age, but everything else does, including you and me. So debt is a thing that rises exponentially, mathematically, whose growth is something which is more organic. And the same story, of course, applies in the United States, where pay has risen over 40 years by 9.2%, against productivity in the US, which has risen by 74%. From 1948 to 73, the Keynesian Golden Age, as it's called, both productivity and pay went up together. If you want to understand Trump, you've got to understand that. So the wealth share of the top 3% in the United States is now double the wealth of America's poorest 90% of the families. So we're in a sort of frozen state right now, frozen state of very high levels of private debt. And we have relied on the emerging markets. We've relied on China and Brazil. And they have been both suppliers and consumers. They have managed both the supply side of the global economy and the demand side of the global economy. I don't know what it was, who it was that said, but someone said in the US today that what is the US going to do when 95% of its customers are abroad? They're not in the US. And what's happened is the emerging markets followed our model. The Chinese decided that the Anglo-American capitalist model was something that they wanted to adapt for their people. So they did what we had done before 2007. They started borrowing. They allowed their banks to lend crazy money. They now have a massive private debt bubble, which is what the Bank of England drew attention to today, and which the Bank of England, and rightly so, regards as a very serious threat to the future of the monetary system. Because both China and Brazil are, in a sense, threatening a crisis. And when they blow themselves up, which may well happen, and the question is only one of timing, then we're going to be flooded, the world is going to be flooded with goods and services from China. As it is, there's massive overcapacity, there are huge gluts. These are now going to be, now we're already in a deflationary environment. And of course you all understand that in a deflationary environment where prices and wages are falling, the value and the price of debt rises without you ever borrowing another penny, while you're asleep. It just keeps rising. And this is great for people who lend money. This is great for bankers, financiers, and others, because, they don't do anything. They fall asleep too. And the wealth of their assets just simply keeps rising in a deflationary environment. Now, in that environment, we get dumped by goods and services from China and Brazil as they blow up their economies. That will not be a pretty sight. So China has a very high, something like 260% of GDP in non-financial sector debt. And then we've already seen China's elites taking money out and following the dollar. The rise of the dollar is causing money to flow out not just from China, but from other emerging markets as well. And that is going to make things a hell of a lot worse for them too. So we need to look to emerging markets for the next crisis, one which is created in our name, one which is created on the basis of our model. So...
One more minute?
Sorry, one more minute?
1 minute, yep.
Oh my God, I haven't started on Europe. I haven't started on Matteo Renzi and Norbert Hofer and the elections on Sunday and what that political shock, if there is going to be a political shock, and it's quite likely, is going to do as an economic shock. I think I just want to say this. The future of the monetary system is very precarious, is very fragile. The question is going to be, as we get more and more authoritarian governments, which is what we are getting, we're moving towards a new age, if I may say this, of fascism. Who is going to be in charge of the new international monetary system? Is it going to be under private authority? Is it going to be Goldman Sachs that's going to run our monetary system? Or is it going to be under public, democratic, and accountable authority? That's the choice. Now, in the 1930s, the monetary system was under private authority. It was left to its own devices. After all, nature would fix itself, would restore to
coming to 10
equilibrium.
minutes.
We got Hitler. Hitler kept his country under private authority.
Okay.
But the leaders of the United States and Europe moved towards public authority over the financial system. And they restored both stability to the financial system in the banks, but also to employment and prosperity. The question is, where will we go in the future? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Anne.
Just make sure that everybody just puts the mic in their then.
No. Thanks very much for that, Anne. And I'm going to be asking a question about the international monetary system shortly in the second part of this as well. So, because
just be kind to me. Yeah.
Well,
I feel very chased. So now we have Jim Rickards. Jim.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to everyone for coming out tonight, although we really appreciate it. I know Ben said thank you for coming out on a really cold night, but I live in New England. This is not that cold to me, but it is, I take it is cold by London standards, so we do appreciate that. And thank Anne for joining us as well. A lot of people, because we're debating partners here tonight, think that Anne and I have met before, but we actually just met tonight on this stage. Yeah. But we did have a sort of a Twitter back and forth, and you know, we would tweak each other on ideas, and that's how this debate evolved. We're both fairly adept at Twitter, not quite as prolific as our president-elect, but I think we managed to hold our own. And I was a little daunted when Anne said she had spent the past weekend reading my book, because whenever anyone says that, I'm reminded of a scene from the movie Patton with George C. Scott early in the film where it's the night before a battle with Rommel, so Patton has his armored corps and he's about to go up against Rommel's Afrika Corps. And the last scene, General Patton is falling asleep in his bed. He's asleep, and the camera pans in, and there's a copy of Rommel's book on his night table. And he's gone to sleep reading Rommel's book. And he goes out the next day. He fights Rommel to a standstill. Rommel has to retreat, and Patton raises his hand in a victory salute and says, "I beat you because I read your book." So whenever anyone says they've read my book, I'm a little caught off guard. But I read some of your stuff, Anne, too, so hopefully we'll be even there. I want to talk about the future of the international monetary system. Obviously, that's why we're here. And I'm going to not talk about money until the last minute of this. I'm going to talk about physics. Anne said that the debt situation is not a question of physics, it's a question of mathematics. But at least when I studied physics, it was mostly mathematics. So I don't disagree, but I think there's plenty of room for physics. I want to ask a question, and I think it's the most important question in economics, or at least in capital markets, I'll say finance. Are capital markets a complex system or not? If you think they're not, you can actually skip the rest of what I have to say and skip my books as well. But if you think they are, if the answer is yes, it's a very big deal, because all of the risk management models, all of the bank stress tests, all of the central bank models are not based on complexity. They're called dynamic general stochastic equilibrium models. There's value at risk. There are assumptions behind them that bear no relationship to how a complex system works. So we have to confront the fact that if capital markets are a complex system, none of the models that the regulators and the bankers and the risk managers are using correspond to reality. They're at best obsolete, at worst they're dangerously wrong. And this is one reason why the regulators and bankers never see the crises coming. They're always ill-prepared when they come. They always underestimate the magnitude. The reaction function is slow and plodding because they don't actually understand what's happening. And I've had conversations with central bankers, members of the Board of Governors, regional reserve bank presidents, and others. Privately, they will tell you they don't know what they're doing. They don't say that in public, but they'll say, we actually don't know what we're doing. They'll say, we try something. If it works, we do a little more. If it doesn't work, we back off, try something else. But this is an experiment. We are all guinea pigs in an experiment by central bankers and regulators who misapprehend the statistical properties of risk. So with that, let's go through the 4 defining characteristics of a complex system. By the way, if you were taking physics at Oxford or Cambridge from someone who knew nothing about finance, just a pure physics course, and you said, I want to learn complexity theory, this is what they would teach you. So none of this is sort of backfitted for capital markets. The first thing is you have what are called autonomous agents. So we'd all be agents. If we were traders or investors, we'd be agents. Ants are agents. Molecules, cells of a moss are agents, and a moss is a complex system. So whatever the individual constituent parts are, those are the agents. So you need 4 characteristics. The first is diversity. I'm not talking about cultural diversity. I'm talking about just different motivations. So because you have to have diversity. If they're all the same, nothing happens. It's a static system, so you need diverse agents. Let's think about capital markets. Do you have diverse agents? Sure. Long, shorts, fear, greed, leveraged, unleveraged, bulls, bears, short-term, long-term. We got lots and lots of diversity of views and motivations in capital markets, so we passed that test. The second test is, are they connected? It doesn't matter if you have diverse agents if they're not somehow connected to each other to form a network. Do we have a network in capital markets? Of course we do. We've got Bloomberg, Reuters, telephone, iPhone, chat. We're probably email. We're probably over-connected, but there's no question about the fact that capital markets are densely networked, densely connected. The third characteristic is the interactivity. In other words, it doesn't matter. Okay, let's say you've got diverse agents. That's good, and you're connected in somehow. Are you interacting? Are you engaging in transactions? Well, that's easy. Capital markets have trillions of dollars a day, stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities. They're an enormous volume of interaction. So that test is clearly met. And the fourth one is adaptive behavior. This is actually the most important one. What it means is that, so you're an agent, you've got some motivation, you're connected to the network, you go out and interact, but you also take feedback. You get information from the system, and that information then changes your behavior. You adapt your behavior. If you're a hedge fund manager and you're losing money, you better adapt fast or you're going to be out of business. Very simple example is if you're sitting in your flat in London and you don't know what the weather's like and you're about to go outside and you look out your window and everyone's walking down the street with a nice down jacket and a pullover hat and a set of mittens, you're probably not going to go outside in a t-shirt. You're probably going to adapt your behavior by putting on a warm jacket. You're going to know from that information that it's cold out. So these are the 4 characteristics: diversity of agents, connectedness, interaction, and adaptive behavior. Capital markets are 4 for 4. They exhibit all of the hallmarks of a complex adaptive system. So once you get to that point, you then go back to the first point I raised, which is, okay, we have a complex system. Complex systems have certain characteristics. They can self-organize, and human systems, which are what capital markets are, do self-organize. In other words, our adaptive behavior, because we affect each other, it takes certain shapes and forms. I'll give you a very simple example. This is technically called an Ising hypersynchronous model, but I can put it in plain English, which is, what if right now one of you got up and ran out of the room? What would the rest of you do? I dare say you'd sit here and listen to the rest of this fascinating debate. You wouldn't go anywhere. You might think it was odd, rude, maybe the person got a text, but you wouldn't do anything else. What if 20 of you got up and ran out of the room? What would the rest of you do? I dare say you'd be right behind them. You say, I don't know what's going on. Maybe there's a threat. Maybe the place is on fire, but I'm not going to wait around to find out. I'm out of here. I like to say when it comes to the dollar, Paul Krugman will be the last one to leave the theater, but But the point is, there's an example of what's called the critical threshold. I can express that mathematically. Your critical threshold is greater than 1, less than 20. Somewhere between 1 and 20, there's a number of people. They leave, you're out of here. What's interesting is we all have a different critical threshold. Some of you are kind of nervous. You're out of here if 3 people leave. Some of you are more bold. It's going to take maybe 30 or 40 people before you leave. Our critical thresholds change every day. Some days we're feeling a little more bold than other times. Well, imagine not just 150 people in an auditorium, but 100 million traders, investors, savers all around the world. Now you can get some idea, all connected, all interacting, all adaptive. You can get some idea of the behavior of complex systems, exactly what I'm describing. And so the point is, that's what we're dealing with. Now, there are a couple characteristics of complex systems that are not taken into account by the standard models. One of them is that the complex systems are prone to collapse. They build and build and build, and then they periodically collapse. There are many, many examples of this. There's one I like to use, and I use these as sort of metaphors, but they're more than metaphors. The mathematics and the system dynamics are actually the same. So you're in the mountains, and it's snowing, and snow is building up on the side of the mountain, and it builds and builds, and an experienced mountaineer can look at that and say, that is unstable, that is going to collapse, this is going to cause an avalanche. You can see it coming, don't know exactly when, and then someday a certain snowflake comes along, it perturbs a few other snowflakes, it lands the wrong way, they start to slide, it creates a chute, it creates momentum, the momentum builds, the whole thing rips loose, the avalanche comes down, kills some skiers, and buries the village below.
1 more minute.
Who do you blame in that situation? Do you blame the snowflake, or do you blame the instability of the system as a whole? My view is that it doesn't matter what snowflake it is. If it wasn't one snowflake, it would be another. If it wasn't today, it would be tomorrow. In other words, it's the instability of the total system that we need to be concerned about. The second point is that the worst thing that can happen in a complex system is an exponential function of scale. Simply put, if you double the size of the system, you do not double the risk. You increase the risk by a factor of 5 or perhaps 10. You increase the risk exponentially. In 2008, all we heard about was too big to fail. Here's the point, and Ann made this point, and I agree. Since 2008, I'll take the 5 largest banks in the United States. They are all larger. They have a larger percentage of the total banking assets. There's greater concentration. They have much larger derivatives books. Everything that was too big to fail in 2008 is bigger and more dangerous today. And given the complex dynamics, given the physics, given the exponential scale, the risk is far greater than we had in 2008. If you have an earthquake is a complex system, by the way, another good example. An earthquake is just the release of energy. That's what it is. That's how you measure and define an earthquake. It's the release of energy. You cannot truncate an earthquake. But imagine if you could, thought experiment. I'm going to truncate an earthquake. What have I done? All I've done is I've stopped the energy from being released. Now that energy is still there. It's being stored up for the next earthquake. Now when you come over to human systems, you can truncate them. You can truncate them with policy, with intervention, and that's what happened in 2008. We were experiencing a financial earthquake. We were days away from the sequential collapse of every financial institution in the world. Lehman had gone, Bear had gone previously, Fannie, Freddie.
Okay, Jim.
Morgan Stanley would have been. My point is, we are primed for a financial catastrophe greater than any in history. And in 1998, Wall Street bailed out a hedge fund, long-term capital. In 2008, the central banks bailed out Wall Street. In 2018, if not sooner, who's going to bail out the central banks? In other words, we're at the point where we are beyond the capacity of the central banks to save the system. There's only one clean balance sheet left in the world. That's the International Monetary Fund. They can print money called special drawing rights. They will probably in the 5s or 10s of trillions. That will be the end of the dollar as a benchmark. Global reserve currency. We'll still have dollars, but they'll be like Mexican pesos. The SDR will be the global reserve currency. There is one other alternative, which I'll talk about in the rebuttal, which is gold. So I see the system heading for collapse.
You're answering the questions I prepared.
For the reasons I described, we will end up, there are 2 states of the end game, SDRs or gold.
Thanks very much. Okay, let's start off with a question where I think actually there might be quite a bit of common ground here, but we'll find out. And I'm going to put this to you first, Jim. Is the international monetary system, as it is currently configured, fit for purpose, or is it past its sell-by date?
It is configured to fit the purposes of the global elite. And when I use that phrase, and it's the subtitle of my book, it's not some deep, dark conspiracy of figures in hooded robes sitting around a mahogany table like a scene from Spectre in a James Bond film. We actually know who they are. It's Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, her first managing deputy director, David Lipton, Mario Draghi, the European Central Bank, figures like Larry Summers and Ken Rogoff at Harvard, public intellectuals like Adair Turner and Anatole Koleski here in the UK. So they're central bankers, they're professors, they're denizens of think tanks, they're public intellectuals. It's a set of people, several hundred, and they run the international monetary system. Their goal is world money. Their goal is to basically, this is part of the globalist agenda, which we're seeing a lot of pushback, by the way, in Brexit and Trump and perhaps Italy. But the globalist agenda is post-national. Those countries are obsolete. Countries are not the countries used to be a solution, beginning in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Countries were a solution, sovereignty was a solution to something like the 30 Years' War. Today, the global elite view countries as the problem, not the solution. The solution is a borderless, seamless, globalized world. So you can deal with things like climate change. You can't have a world solution unless you have a world problem. Climate change kind of fits the bill. But you're going to need world money as well. The world money is the SDR. They are moving on that path. And I don't want to take up too much time, and this will go back to Anne. But they're moving down that path gradually. But here's where they're wrong. And the elites are always the last to know. Day to day, they're on the commanding heights. But in the real world, they're just always the last to know. They think they can pull off this project over the next 10 or 15 years, a little bit like a kid who steals money from his mom's wallet, £1 at a time, thinks mom won't notice. They all rely on the fact that we won't notice. But what's going to happen is there's going to be a mashup. The crisis I described in the opening remarks will occur before the elites get to the end game of the world money system, and they'll have to accelerate it. They'll have to do it on a crash basis. And I actually agree with Anne that the solution won't be socialism, it'll be neo-fascism.
So your question was, is the financial system fit for purpose? And am I using the right thing? Right. No, it's not fit for purpose. And for the reason that Jim has said, actually, which is that the financial system exists to serve the economy, to serve the real economy, to serve society, to enable us to become prosperous, to enable us to do what we need to do, to enable us to fight climate change. It doesn't do that anymore. Before the crisis, banks used to lend. We invented the banking system in order to have institutions that would manage the credit system for us and would enable credit to flow so that entrepreneurs, shipbuilders, people who built steam engines, people who went on wild trips to Australia could have their ventures financed. After the crisis, we started lending to the banks. We deposited more money in the banking system than the banking system lent out. This is bizarre and perverse. Why? And why has it happened? It's because the system is as Jim is trying to argue. Jim is arguing that it's an organic, biological, dynamic system. It's not. It's a human social construct. It's something that we built over time. One of my great heroes is a chap called John Law, who unfortunately was done for murder and was a womanizer and a gambler, but he invented... I love guys like that, actually. But he invented and designed and managed the monetary system. He took it across to the princes of France, and then he got a bit carried away, and there was a South Sea bubble, and it all fell apart, and that was the end of his reputation. For me, he was a genius, because he invented and he designed and developed a monetary system which enabled us to do what we can do. It meant we could finance and do things. Now, that monetary system, that social construct, is not natural. It's not a biological system. It's not something that can just run on its own. It would like to. The reason why it's no longer fit for purpose is that it's turned itself into this deregulated, self-organized system. The system's now organized by all those speculators and gamblers out there in the stratosphere. They're organizing it for themselves. They're trading in a loop, and they're making billions of bucks, and the rest of us are left behind, right? But we invented the financial system as a construct, and we, it's done this to us before. It did this to us in the 1920s. In the 1920s, the financial system went crazy and turned itself into some sort of biological, organic thing that just managed itself, that became self-regulating, and it blew itself up. And we took it back again, and we slowly built it and reconstructed it. And Jim will admit to this, and Keynes was that person that did it, I have to say. And I just want to quickly say, Jim, the thing that upsets me about the way you talk about Keynes, you talk about him as if he's about spending and fiscal and taxes. It's not called the general theory of employment, tax and spend. It's called the general theory of employment, interest and money. The only thing he cared about was the monetary system. He said, if you manage that, you will never have to bother about fiscal policy. Budgets will always balance, okay? So we reconstructed the financial system, and we had from 1945 to 1971, we lived through what all economists, including Jim, calls the golden age of economics. There was prosperity. We made progress. People had decent livelihoods. There was big fights with the Soviet Union, but in the West, where the system worked, of course it didn't work in the Soviet Union, in the West, we had stability, we had political, even in Africa, people became more prosperous.
Why did that come to an end, do you think?
Sorry?
Why did that come to an end?
Why did it come to an end? You know why it did? Because actually what had happened, it was no longer run by the world's creditors. It was no longer run by Goldman Sachs. Do you know what I love about Roosevelt? And Jim doesn't like Roosevelt. What I love about Roosevelt is that he convened the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 in this wonderful hotel in Bretton Woods, which I've been to, and he would not allow a single banker to come to the meeting. There was not actually, that's not true. There was a Chicago banker. There was a mate of his that he allowed to come in. But there were no bankers when we designed the architecture that gave us the golden age of economics. Now we can do it again, but we're not going to do it now. What we're now going to do is get fascism. We're going to live through what we lived through the damn 30s. Our parents, our families, that lived through that and died through that. We're going to go through that all over again. And then we'll sit down and say, the financial system is not a biological organic system. It's not self-regulating.
I think we're at that stage of the debate where we tear up the timeline and just sort of go comment and rebuttal. I can tell.
I just wanted to start the fire.
Yeah, good job. I can tell Ann is a very seasoned debater because the room is littered with straw men, but let me rebut a few of those points.
Keep it civil.
First of all, I reject Keynesianism and embrace Keynes. Keynes had nothing to do with Keynesianism. Keynesianism, as it's known today, neo-Keynesianism, or the neoliberal consensus, as it's now called, was invented by Paul Samuelson at MIT in 1947.
I agree with
Keynes was dead by a few years. Keynes himself was a pragmatist, which I very much admire. My favorite quote from Keynes was he was traveling. He was in a long-running debate with Churchill, and Churchill sent him a cable and said, "I'm beginning to come around to your point of view." And Keynes cabled back, said, "It's unfortunate. I've started to change my mind." In other words, Keynes was that kind of pragmatist, embraced gold at certain points, rejected gold at certain points. I like that kind of approach. Now, Ann's point that our system, our monetary system, is not the biological, organic type of system I described. It doesn't operate that way, that it's a construct. I would suggest that the human beings are complex systems non-pareil. You can take a reductionist point of view and say, okay, there's a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of silicon, some carbon molecules. It actually, if someone's done the math, it comes out to about $12 worth of chemicals. But you can take those $12 worth of chemicals, put them in a bucket, throw in some water, shoot electric beams through them, and absolutely nothing will happen. We are who we are. We have what are called emergent properties. So I'm speaking to you and you're listening, or you'll ask questions later and I'll listen to you. There's nothing about the list of chemicals in a human from which you could infer speech and cognition. Those are emergent properties. They come out of the soup. They come out of the ether. That's what a complex dynamic system is. Now, I don't disagree with Ann that, yeah, Bretton Woods, a set of people sat down and wrote, in effect, a treaty, Articles of Agreement. They did the same thing at Genoa in 1922. They did the same thing in a less formal way at the G20 meetings in November 2008. The G20 continues to come together. So they set these rules, but the thing doesn't work like clockwork. As you go forward, as you go through a timeline, the adaptive behavior that I described, the motivations, the greed, the misplaced or misaligned incentives begin to come to the fore, and that's where we are time and time again, and that's why these systems collapse. So the other thing I just want to add is that before I came here, I was tweeting, Ann and Pettitfor and I are going to have this debate, and I got a lot of comments like, "Boy, you two, you're not going to agree on anything. She's an advisor to Labor, and you're running around the world saying Trump was going to win," which I did. But the fact is, we actually have a lot of common ground. There might only be one or two things that Ann and I disagree on. See, she put words in my mouth, so I'm going to put words in her mouth. There might be only one or two things we disagree on, but there might actually be the end game. We might agree on all the diagnosis, all the dysfunction, all the problems, all the instability. Actually, based on what you've been saying, I do agree with a lot of that. So, but my only point is that, when you talk about the end or the future of the international monetary system, as if, people say, well, I was in a meeting once in Washington, a little closed-door session. There was a senior Treasury official sitting 2 seats to my left, and I spoke more or less the way I'm speaking tonight about SDRs and stability, the IMF having the only clean balance sheet, et cetera. And this Treasury official harumphed and said, "Don't you know that the dollar has been the global reserve currency? It is today, and it always will be." And I turned to him, I said, I feel like I'm sitting on Whitehall in 1913, listening to John Bull talk about how sterling is the global reserve currency and always will be, and now you're heading to 90 cents to the dollar, or 90 cents to the pound. So we have had resets, 1914, 1922, 1931, 1971, 2008 with the IMF issued SDRs in 2009. I might have been the only one who didn't work at the IMF who noticed, but they did. There's these resets, these collapses do happen periodically. Currencies do change hands. The SDR is coming, and that's. But beyond that, again, Ann might have other solutions, but my point is that I think our diagnosis of the problem is frighteningly the same.
I think that's right too, and I agree, but we do fundamentally differ, Jim, and this is what I want to talk about, because, I think that your analysis is defeatist in a sense that if that's the case, then there is really not a lot to hope for, But if we do have human agency, and if we are able of creating and maintaining and building systems, then let's do this. Now, I want to go back to a story about a guy called Joseph Townsend, whom you would never have heard of. He was born in 1739. But he wrote a story that became influential with both Malthus and Ricardo. And the story is so powerful because it resonates today. And it's this, that he'd heard about, there'd been some adventurer go out to some Pacific islands, Fernandez Islands, and they'd found that there were animals on these islands and that they'd survived somehow with the scarcity of what was a natural condition of scarcity. And these animals had, on their own, kind of worked out who was going to get the food and how and why, and so on. And so he argued that these goats and dogs, living in a natural condition of scarcity, could fight over, but they would learn to live in harmony just on their own without any political interference. And he regarded this as a model for the economy. And it's still the model for the economy, okay? You only need one thing. You don't need the political system to intervene if your model is biological. You don't need the democratic system. You don't need the voice of the people to intervene in the market. You leave it to the goats and the dogs to fight over the scarce food and to sort it out. And within the market theory, there is this idea that the only thing you should have there is the price. The price, they will work out the price between them. So in 1971, to get to my point, we had something called competition and credit control in here, boring piece of regulation which nobody heard of and people still haven't heard of. And This boring piece of regulation said to bankers, thou shalt not lend for speculation, thou shalt only lend for productive activity which generates income and repays the debt of the lending. That's all you can allow to do. Furthermore, you know, we are concerned about the rate of interest on what you lend. If you lend above the capacity of your borrower to earn money to repay, you're making the debt unpayable. That's bad news for you, the creditor, it's bad news for the debtor. So we want you to manage all this. So competition and credit control was a way of managing this. And they had similar regulators in the US. And the bankers said, no, we know. You know, this is an organic, biological system. We can allow the cats and the dogs to fight over the debt, and the one paying the highest price can have the loan. And after that, the only determinant of who got a loan after 1971 was whoever was willing to pay the highest price. So immediately, the price of the loan, as you know, is the rate of interest. Immediately, interest rates started to rise. But also, we got crazy, easy money, right? Anybody could have a loan, didn't care if you were going to go gambling, didn't care if you were going to put it on the lottery, as long as you were willing to pay 72% on it, or 14 or 8 or 9%, right? So it was only the price of the loan that was allowed to determine whether or not someone would. So, of course, we got what we got. We got a massive expansion of lending, which led to inflation, too much money chasing too few goods and services. Who got the blame? The trade unions, of course, because when prices rose, they wanted their wages to rise.
So, Arnie,
so it went up and up and up. So this system was, until 1971, orderly. We managed these crazy guys in the financial system.
So, Anne, are you saying that the fault lies with the rules being changed and the rules that determine the system?
Yeah. And it's not just rules. I don't want to even call them rules, because rules are, you know, some of the rules are picky and bureaucratic and so on. It's about whether or not we as a society and as a community and as an economy want to manage our financial system so that it serves the interests of the capitalists in our economy that want to do and make things, and of the people who live in it and who want to be prosperous. Or do we not manage it and leave it to biological forces? And my answer is that we need to manage it, because money, and Jim and I need to get onto this, is not like gold, it's not silver, it's not a commodity, it's not a thing which is in shortage of supply. It's as Schumpeter argued, it's a promise to pay. That's all that money is, right? What stands behind the promise to pay is a bit of gold, collateral, a contract underpinned by a criminal justice system which gets you to uphold the contract, and an interest rate to repay over a period of time. And then you have money. So I saw Bernanke. I have to say this about the Americans. They're wonderfully more open than we are. And after the crisis in March 2009, Bernanke gave an interview to 60 Minutes, I think it's called, a wonderful TV show. First time ever a governor of the Federal Reserve had given an interview on television. And the day before that, he'd given AIG $85 billion as part of it, one tranche of several amounts of $85 billion to bail out AIG. Now, AIG was an insurance company. It should never have had an account with the Fed, okay? So the old journalist says to him, now, Mr. Bernanke, where did you get $85 billion from? Did you get it from taxpayers? And he says, no. He said, we have something at the Federal Reserve that every commercial bank has got. It's called a computer. And we enter a number into the computer. 85 billion involves 11 noughts. And we enter the number into the computer, and we charged it to AIG's account. Of course, they demanded collateral from AIG, and I think may even have been repaid by now. Or some of that collateral has come good on them, I don't know. But the fact is, that's how all credit is created. A borrower throws up some collateral, a number is entered into, the banker makes a risk assessment, a number is entered into the ledger or the computer, and credit is created, and that gives the borrower purchasing power. It's a wonderful thing. This is why I love John Law. Before John Law, you had to hand over a bar of gold in order to be able to do something. If you were Mr. Stevenson and you want to invent a steam engine, and nobody had ever heard of a steam engine, and nobody knew whether or not it was going to generate any money, It was really hard to get a loan. You had to go to the robber baron at the top of the castle, and he would say to you, well, I'll lend it to you, but I'll lend it to you at 15%. And you didn't know if your steam engine was going to earn 15%. And by the way, he would say, can I have bring up that beautiful daughter of yours as well? I'd like to see her too. So
I'd like to throw out
Yeah.
I'd like to throw out a hypothetical, actually, if I may, to just to get us onto the, because we discussed the system as it is,
yeah.
the flaws with it. Let's throw out a hypothetical scenario that either the world comes together and decides to do this, or perhaps we have another financial crisis and it has to, and we're looking to reinvent the system. What is the best course of action to take? What ought those in power do?
What we really need to do is go back to a system that worked fairly well. And Anne had a kind word for the Americans, so I'll throw in a kind word for the Brits. When they're so inclined, and they're not lately, but when they're so inclined, the Brits are the best regulators in the world. Because before I spent more time with economics and writing, I was a regulatory lawyer, a securities lawyer for most of my career. And the way you get a license, a securities license or a banking license in the United States is you hire a lawyer, you read a 95-page rule book, you fill out a 75-page form, fingerprints and all kinds of stuff, and then you send it in, and then you wait an inordinate amount of time, and then your license comes back, and that's how you get your license. And I once had a client where we had all the licenses in the U.S., but we were opening an office in London, and they needed the same license in the U.K. And I talked to U.K. counsel, and they said, well, what you do is you come over, and you sit down for a meeting, and they decide whether you're fit and proper. And my client said, what does that mean? And I said, I guess we're going to find out. But the point is, it was very subjective. There was an interim effect. That's exactly what Anne was describing. You know, you may take deposits and make loans for commercial purposes, and you're expected to earn a rate of return. It's a little, it's simple. It's not a 1,000-page rule book, but it actually works if you have the will to enforce it. And the bankers are supposed to internalize the culture. They're supposed to know, don't go into the gray area because it won't end well for you. And you create incentives. You create a system of incentives. That's all gone. Unfortunately, the UK has copied the U.S. model, and I dare say the European model, because one of the great things about Brexit is the UK can get back to its roots with the common law as opposed to the Napoleonic Code. Goes back to the Code of Justinian. The European solution is if you have a problem, write a rule, and if it doesn't solve the problem, write another rule, and if that doesn't solve the problem, write another rule, and just keep going, just keep adding more rules until you never solve the problem. The UK method used to be judgment, equity, common sense, but you would scare people with these things because no one really quite knew what they meant. So how do you fix the system? Well, I'll stick to my complexity theory and scaling metrics and risk as an exponential function of scale and say, how do you deal with avalanche danger? Well, if you go up in Switzerland, up on the high ridgeline, or Colorado, Aspen Highlands early in the morning, you'll see the ski patrol out there with cannons and dynamite blowing up the snow, actually, and just obviously reducing the avalanche danger. But a physicist would say, you are descaling the system. You are making the system safer by breaking it into smaller components. It's exactly what we had in the U.S., by the way, from 1933 to 1999. So what happened in the 1920s? Banks went out and originated garbage loans. They securitized them, sold them to their customers. The market crashed in 1929. The customers lost the money. And so Congress had hearings. They said, well, let's look into this. And after the hearings, they said, we have a solution. From now on, you may take deposits and make loans, or you may underwrite and sell securities, but you may not do both. There's an inherent conflict of interest there. This was our Glass-Steagall law. By the way, Glass-Steagall was 6 pages. Dodd-Frank was over 1,000 pages, an example of how there's no end to the rule writing. But Glass-Steagall, so you can do one or the other. That was the law in the United States until 1999. Then a corrupt cabal led by Sandy Weill and others, and Bill Clinton and Senator Phil Gramm, who after he passed the law became vice chairman of UBS, said, we're smarter than the Congress of 1933. Those guys were dopes. This is the modern age. They repealed Glass-Steagall. They allowed banks and securities businesses to merge. What happened? They originated garbage loans, they securitized them and sold them to their customers. They did exactly what they did in the 1920s. Is it any surprise that the system collapsed in 2008? It was an exact replay as if nothing had been learned. So first thing we need to do, go back to Glass-Steagall, or in the UK, go back to pre-Big Bang, 1985. That was your deregulation, pre-1985 regulation in the UK. Number two, break up the banks. When I started in banking, J.P. Morgan, what is J.P. Morgan today, was 5 huge banks. It was the old J.P. Morgan, the Chase Manhattan Bank, which was no shrinking violet, Manufacturers Hanover, Chemical, there were other banks in there. Break it up into 5 parts. By the way, the model for this is a vessel with watertight holes. You can punch a hole in the side of the vessel. One hole will fill up with water, but the watertight compartments will keep the ship afloat. The ship won't sink. Same thing if you break J.P. Morgan into 5 or 6 or 10 banks, for that matter. Any one of those banks can fail. Too bad for the stockholders, but they won't take down the system. This is exactly like throwing dynamite on the snow. Descale the system, eliminate the risk. Third thing you need to do, eliminate all derivatives, all of them. By the way, I invented some what are today large segments of the derivatives market when I was at Long-Term Capital Management as a lawyer in 1994, 95. So I'm a little bit like Dr. Frankenstein. I helped create the monster, but who knows?
Is this your confession?
Well, it's just a fact, right? So who knows more about the monster than the creator? And having worked in really the most advanced kinds of derivatives with 2 Nobel Prize winners and 16 finance PhDs, I know a lot about these. Just get rid of all of them. They serve no purpose except to allow bankers to steal money from their customers and to punt. But of course, when it all goes bad, it all falls on the taxpayers. Now, maybe some Chicago-style, old-school exchange-traded futures that are heavily margined with, commercial underlying used for commercial hedging purposes, that may be fine. But the off-balance sheet, unlimited, third derivative of a derivative types of swap contracts serve no purpose at all other than to enrich bankers and occasionally blow up the system. So you need to break up the big banks, ban derivatives, separate investment and commercial banking. This is exactly like blowing up the snow or putting watertight holes in a vessel. This will keep your system safe. But the probability of that happening is 0. It is not going to happen. So I'm not actually a doom and gloomer. I don't like writing the books I write without offering positive solutions, and I do offer those positive solutions. But as an analyst, I would say that they have no chance of becoming law. Again, I was in a meeting at the Treasury once, and giving a presentation not unlike the one I'm giving now, and I tend to talk too much, so I interrupted myself, and I turned to the senior Treasury official, and I said, I don't envy your job because the bankers own this town. And I expect him to jump out of his seat in outrage and tell me that was ridiculous. He didn't. He looked at me and said, "You're right." So there's not much hope for it. We may not be able to save the system or save the world, but we can save our families and ourselves by getting some of our assets out of these digital slaughterhouses called banks into physical gold in safe non-bank storage. Don't put your gold in a bank because there's a very high conditional correlation between the time you really want your gold and the time the banks are closed. Those two things are going to work. Those two things are going to happen to, no, seriously, those two things are going to happen together. You're going to say, because the world's going to be falling apart and the elites are going to shut the banks and you're going to be banging on the door saying, give me my gold. Make sure it's in non-bank storage, but you can protect yourself.
I just want to bring Anne in. Anne, were we making the system? What should it look like?
Pretty much just as Jim has described, actually. And you see, I think, Jim, you're contradicting yourself here because you're agreeing with me that actually it is possible for human intervention, for intelligent beings to intervene to manage and stabilize this system. But we agree that it can't be done now, that it's out of control, and that we don't have the political will, we don't have the vision, we don't have the intelligence at the top of our political system.
If we assume all that away, like good economists,
yeah,
then what should it look like?
It should look like the financial system is subordinate to the real economy and is serving the real economy. And it should be boring and dull. Nobody should have the ambition to become a bank clerk, right? Unless they want to be able to do ballroom dancing in the evening, So sometimes it's good to have jobs like that because then you can do ballroom dancing. And that's really why I think that's what the banking system should become. And it should not be what it is now, which is a system which enables a very small number of people to get rich on the back of nothing, actually, on the back of synthetic collateral. So much of the collateral, Jim's book's fascinating because he tells you about how these things are constructed. They're making money out of nothing. And that's why when it blows up, it's such a shock to them. They've forgotten that everything that underpins this house of cards is synthetic. So Yeah, we've got to have Glass-Steagall. We've got to manage the system. But the thing about this, and Jim and I are going to disagree very strongly on this, I think. For me, we have to manage capital flows across borders. I believe in restoring autonomy to countries and to governments, above all to democracies. The reason why we're having people vote for Trump and the reason why they're going to vote for Mrs. Le Pen in France is because they want to be protected from Mr. Townsend's goats and dogs, basically. They don't want to live in a system where they have to fight to the death to get bread for their kids and to survive. They want that system to be managed so that they can live stable, decent lives, right? And they now turning, because they've given up on the Democrats. I agree with Jim that actually the role played by Robert Rubin, by Clinton, and even by Obama in upholding Wall Street has deeply disillusioned and frightened the people. They're now looking to a strong billionaire to protect them from that. He's going to build a wall between them and Mexico, right? And he's going to, by the way, introduce capital controls to pay for the wall, right? So he doesn't have any compunctions about it. So we've to avoid that happening, to avoid fascism, we've got to be able to say to the people, you don't have to worry. We will care about your prosperity. We won't just care about the people in the City of London and the people in Wall Street. So, to do that, we have to have capital controls. It's not going to be possible for Apple and Starbucks and Amazon to take their money to abroad and to not pay taxes. It's not going to be possible to do that anymore. It's not going to be possible to make a quick buck here and then to borrow cheap here and lend dear to the Brazilians. That's not going to be possible anymore. This is effortless rent-seeking behavior, which we should ban. It doesn't help. So for me, it's capital control, it's management of interest rates across the full spectrum of lending, and we must have a debate, Jim, about whether interest rates are really low, because I don't believe they are. And for ordinary people, they're low for bankers. But I don't know anyone who's borrowing at 0.25% at the moment. And we must separate, break up the banks, make them smaller, blow up all of that. I agree with that. And we must make the banking, the finance profession learn once again that they are servants to the real economy, not masters.
See, one person left the room and no one else left, so that's...
I was just thinking
that's empirical. We didn't rehearse that. And we're going to pay for the wall by charging Mexico for the water from the Rio Grande so they can go thirsty if they don't want to pay for it.
We do that by managing flows of Mexican money.
But I agree with you about capital controls. And I would say that capital controls, I don't want to torch these metaphors, but capital controls are exactly like the watertight compartments. Throw sand in the gears. And by the way, I've always favored a Tobin tax, which the bankers are horrified. How can you're hurting liquidity? You're supposed to hurt liquidity. When things are too liquid, too scale, too easy, that's when you get these bubbles. A little sand in the gears is not a bad thing. Ann and I agree, actually, on a lot of these solutions. There's some direct overlap, like a Glass-Steagall kind of thing, more regulation. I would agree with capital controls. You introduced that idea. I agree that's a very good, at least as an option. You should be able to put them on from time to time. Why give direct foreign investment a free option on converting back to dollars and depleting the reserves of an emerging market central bank? I want to charge you for the option. The option is I might shut the door, and that's going to cost you money. That's your option premium. Yeah. So I spent too much time with Myron Scholes.
Okay, guys,
I've
got one final burning question before I throw it open to the audience. And it's 3 questions. I'll put it to you first, Anne. Is gold money?
No.
Can I answer that?
You give your one-word answer and then we'll go back to Anne.
No, gold is not money, it's collateral. And it's good collateral, but that's all it is.
Gold is money. It's the best form of money. Now, what you said is gold money. To me, the deeper question is, what is money? Because we've been talking for an hour. We're going to talk another half hour with some audience participation. What is money? Well, historically, anthropologically, at various times, shells have been money, feathers have been money, gold and silver have been money. Today, euros and dollars are money. Bitcoin is money. I don't know Bitcoin. I don't recommend it to clients, but I would say it's money. And then people say, but they're not backed by anything. Bitcoin's not backed by anything. The dollar's not backed by anything. The euro's not backed by anything. And I say, no, you're wrong. They're all backed by one thing, which is confidence. If you have confidence, if you and I have confidence that something is money, if you're willing to take it from me in exchange for goods and services, and if you're confident that you can give it to someone else and they'll take it for goods and services, then that's money.
But isn't it barter, Jim?
No. By the way, there's a excellent...
Why is it barter?
Well, Well, Jim said if someone's confident that you give them money and then they can give that to somebody else, this is barter.
No, because it's widely accepted. Barter, if I give you some corn for some
Yeah.
rope, I have no ability, the next person may not want the rope. That's barter. That's the problem with barter. It's the simultaneous, meeting simultaneous wants and needs, and that's difficult in a barter system because the two things we might want to trade might have no value to anyone else. But money is the medium of exchange. Money is, it is money, can or cannot be money. Things are money at sometimes and not money at others. Feathers are not money today. I wouldn't want to pay my dinner bill tonight with feathers, but it has been at certain times at a tribal level in certain societies, but it's all based on confidence. And the point I'm making is that confidence is fragile. It can be very easily lost. And when it's lost, it's impossible to regain. And my greatest concern is that the people running the money system don't understand that. They've got their models. They think they can go to another $8 trillion. The modern monetary theorists, my friend Stephanie Kelton and Paul McCulley and Richard Duncan and Warren Mosler and others around the world see no problem with the Fed taking its balance sheet to $8 trillion or $12 trillion in the next crisis, and I say no. First of all, you have political opposition. Let's not underestimate that. But there is an invisible confidence boundary. You will cross it. You won't know you did until it's too late. You'll find out the hard way. We came very close in the late 1970s. In 1977, the United States issued treasury bonds denominated in Swiss francs. They were called the Carter bonds. Nobody wanted dollars, not at a price the Treasury was willing to pay. So we issued bonds in Swiss francs. We came very close to losing confidence in the dollar system at the time. Paul Volcker and Ronald Reagan restored it. But that could easily happen again. Again, bear in mind, we're dealing on a much, much larger scale. I think a lot of Ann's remedies would work, but I'm not an idealist. I am a realist. And I say, okay, there is a set of remedies that would work. I think we agree on that, but they won't be implemented. This is my point. Yeah. Not in time, not before this calamity comes. And so what I try to do is, okay, I know what the answer is. It's not going to happen. The calamity's coming. What can I do now to prepare for it? And also, what will this system look like? And that's kind of our big topic tonight. And I actually would like to ask Ann, in the next global liquidity crisis, when everybody wants their money back, people say, oh, I have money in stocks and I have money in bonds. And I say, no, you don't. You have stocks and bonds. If you want money, you have to sell those things in a crashing market and try to get the money and hope the bank is open. But so when everybody wants their money back, where will the liquidity come from in the next crisis, in your view?
Well, it won't. It will have been drained.
Okay. My answer would be that it will come from the IMF in the form of trillions of SDRs. No. If it works, it will only be because no one understands it. I mean, I've met PhD economists with specialties in international economics who cannot give you a straight answer as to what an SDR is. But it's fiat money. IMF is a printing press. It's no different than dollars or euros. They might be able to pull it off. My own view is that people will look at it and say, you know, we've lost confidence in these other kinds of fiat money. This is just one more fiat money. We have no confidence in this either. Where's the gold?
I think we should go to questions.
Yeah, good idea.
Get the audience involved.
Can I ask if one of my colleagues can do the walking up and down bit? Okay, show of hands who, gentleman at the back there. Yep.
Thank you for a very entertaining debate. It's an unusual debate in that it seems that there are more points of agreement than points of difference. My question is concerned with the fact that a lot of these discussions have been about the nature of the financial system and the economic system and economic growth. And although we've had enormous supposed growth over the past 50 years, we've had enormous improvements in productivity, undoubtedly, the majority of people are actually not better off, they're worse off. And there is very little addressing of the fact that we actually operate within a context that we have certain resources in terms of energy, we have certain resources in terms of raw materials, and wealth can only be created within that. How do the speakers see an evolution of prosperity given those finite limits to the material world.
What's your name?
My name is Derek Dearden.
Go ahead.
No, are you going to ask a few or just?
On?
Oh,
Do-
do you want me to answer?
Yeah,
or can I
yes,
have
yes.
A few more? No, I'm very happy to answer. So it's a very important question, Derek, because the thing is that we, I mean, I don't like to use the word growth at all. By the way, can I just say it was only invented in the 1970s by Sam Britton on the Financial Times and the OECD, and that was at a time of full employment. We used to talk about the level of output, the level of employment. Was it too high? Was it too low? And at a point of full employment, they said, oh my goodness, it was also because of the way the financial system was developing. You know, ordinary people, ordinary entrepreneurs were making profits, but the financiers were making capital gains. And capital gains can be exponential as long as things are going well. And people like Sam Britton began to say, wow, you know, we're not growing exponentially. We should be able to. So they said, he was part of it, he called himself a growth man, set a test for the British economy that it should expand by 50% over 10 years. And that very ambition, which was also backed by the OECD, was the thing that gave us inflation, because, you know, when you're in a position of full employment. So ever since then, we've used this term growth as if there's no birth and death in this thing involved, and it just goes up like that. When we know, as you say, that there are finite limits to the Earth's resources, and indeed to human resources. You know, there are finite limits to the amount of hours of work I can do in a day, etc., etc. So what we have now is a monetary system that is chasing these extraordinary growth rates, which you can get in the money. You can make big bucks in doing the kind of securitization that Jim's been talking about. It's almost effortless activity. You can sit on your butt and earn huge sums of money from a London property, really, effortlessly. Those capital gains contrast with the profits that are made by a genuine entrepreneur, you know, the Apple iPhone people or Nike shoes or the guy growing tomatoes.
I'm a genuine entrepreneur.
Right. So you have to work with the land on the one hand, in the broadest sense of the word, you know, property, land, if you're a farmer or whatever. And on the other hand, you also have to work with labour if you're an entrepreneur. If you're working in the finance sector, you engage neither with land nor labour. You earn rent effortlessly. Now, what happened is that our economy was kind of distorted. Well, everybody, I mean, that's why Tesco's is now a bank. They thought, why the hell are we sitting here, you know, stacking shelves, selling tomato sauce, when we could be selling money and making money effortlessly on it? And
Okay, I just want to...
so this contrast between that kind of thinking and the finite world we're in is what's led us into this mess. So what we have to do is stop that kind of thinking.
I would just add that I don't agree that it's a finite world. Certainly physical commodity, there's only so much coal, et cetera. Those things are finite, but human ingenuity is infinite. And so the question is, can we unleash the human ingenuity? Now, I agree completely. It's just a fact that we've had very weak growth, and the little growth we have had has gone disproportionately. The income inequality is close to all-time highs. The Gini coefficient, that's a measure of income inequality, of the United States just passed Mexico. When I grew up, Mexico was the classic oligarchical society. Welcome to Mexico North. To Ann's point about, you know, the joke when I was coming up was, you know, if you had 3 children, you know, the bright one became a doctor, the kind of smart one became a lawyer, and the not so bright one became a banker. I became a banker in the fullness of time. But the point is, that was what, in the 70s, it was what Ann described. It was the boring, uninteresting, and you were there to serve commerce. You were not there as an end in itself. Today, all you need to know is that Jamie Dimon has a personal net worth in excess of $1 billion. How does a banker, look, it's fine with Bill Gates, he actually added value, or Steve Jobs added value. I'm happy that they're billionaires because they've added a lot to society. Jamie Dimon is a parasite. He got his $1 billion by sucking it out of society. He extracts wealth, he doesn't create wealth. And this is the problem.
Yeah.
Let's take another question.
Thank you. name's Russell Yardley. 14 of the Italian banks are apparently bust, to the tune of 286 billion euros. If any of them fall, do you see it precipitating Deutsche Bank fall with 12 times the derivatives exposure of the entire German economy? And therefore, if Deutsche Bank falls, do you see the end of the EU?
Well, I'll give you a scientific answer. The scientific answer is that it could. Now, that sounds like I'm waffling. Why don't I say it will or it won't? But it's like the snowflake. In other words, we know the system's unstable. We know the system is primed for collapse. Is the Italian banking crisis, is that a snowflake that starts an avalanche, or is it just another snowflake that lands waiting for some other snowflake? So that's the technical answer. But just to kind of address the issue more directly, you have an Italian referendum on Sunday. The Italians will vote no. Renzi will resign. The Italians will have to form a new government. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan since last summer have been working the phones, trying to line up commitments to recapitalize the Italian banking system. Renzi wants a bailout. He didn't get the memo from the G20 meeting in Brisbane, Australia, in November 2014 that there are no more bailouts. From now on, we bail in. Bail in means we don't use taxpayer money to prop up the banks. We basically take deposits in excess of the insured amount. We convert you to equity holders in a bad bank. Existing equity gets wiped out. Bondholders take a haircut to the extent needed to fill the hole in the balance sheet, and that's how you recapitalize banks. So Merkel looked at Renzi and said, don't you dare bail out those banks, because from now on we do bail-ins. And Renzi turned around and said, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. You can't bail out Deutsche Bank. And the Germans have said, you're right. So this whole thing is a mess. Now, what the problem is, while Goldman and JP Morgan have been lining up, kind of soft circles from Kuwait Investment Authority and Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Renzi wants to do a backdoor bailout. He wants to say, okay, maybe some institutions will get a haircut, but all these individual bondholders who should suffer large losses in a bail-in scenario, they happen to be voters. This stuff was sold to the Italian public, not to large institutions. And the EU has sort of said, yeah, you can't bail them out, but you can compensate them for a fraud. So let's call it a fraud, and let's compensate people for the fraud. Again, this is a backdoor bailout, but you're going to need a government to do that, and you're not going to have a government after Monday. I mean, you have some kind of interim government, but Goldman's not going to get those commitments until there's a government that's willing to say, yeah, we'll pay off all these bondholders on a fraud theory because Brussels said we could. So this whole thing is a ticking time bomb, and they thought they could get it done at the end of September. They spent all summer, raising the money. Now they're like, well, we'll wait till after the referendum. They're going to get to the middle of December, find out that they're not going to have a government that can back them up. They can't do this bailout or bail-in or whatever you want to call it. They can't restructure the Italian banking system. As you get to there's a global dollar shortage going on. It's the most dangerous thing out there, if you want my opinion, the global dollar shortage. As you get to year-end, people naturally reduce their balance sheets. There's going to be stress at year-end. And everyone's going to turn around and look at Deutsche Bank. And that stock's going to go to €1, maybe 2. So could this be a catalyst for global financial crisis? Absolutely. I'm not saying it will, by the way. Under my theory, I've been wrong before. I saw things like Amaranth was a hedge fund, lost $6 billion in 1 week. And I said, here we go, the system's caving in. And I was wrong. JP Morgan just lifted the book and nothing bad happened other than people lost $6 billion. But my point is, maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I'm watching it very carefully.
Can I say that the thing about it that's so tragic is that it was so obviously predictable, inevitable, because the whole Eurozone is a very bizarre, it's based on this principle that actually governments don't need central banks, they don't need to manage their economies, that actually the economy can manage itself. And all you need is a central bank, called the ECB, and what it does, I'm not at all sure. It doesn't have a government at its back, and governments don't have a central bank at their backs. So we've got this very bizarre arrangement built on the theory that the economy is organic and it can self-regulate. And so what has happened is collapse. Of course it doesn't work. Of course countries need central banks, and of course they need to be able to adjust their currencies. And of course they need to adjust depending on where they are in economic cycles and so on. And Italy hasn't been able to do that. And then to make matters worse, Mr. Schäuble and the Germans are saying, Italy cannot stimulate her economy. She can't do what every other government has done, including our own and including the United States, which is to use the central bank and the government's powers to generate private economic activity, never even public, and create jobs and generate income and profits. And then the banks can get paid. But no, the Germans have said no to that, basically, or not even just the Germans, it's part of this whole ideology, that you don't need to do anything because nature will sort it all out. And now we're seeing that it's not going to sort it out. And it's going to be awful. I mean, already, the reason why the Italians are going to vote no is they've been bailed in already. They've already lost money. They've already it's the shareholders who are really mad as hell at the moment. So, and then it's those who haven't got decent jobs, whose kids can't get jobs, whose kids can't buy somewhere to live, who don't have a future. Those people are really angry.
Okay, let's take another question.
So I just did want to briefly address the last part of the question because I did. Yeah, all these bad things could happen, but it won't be. There won't be the end of the euro. The euro will be around. 1991-92, Margaret Thatcher was bitterly opposed to German reunification, and the reason she gave was every time the Germans get together, they take over Europe, which is true. So I understand the euro as the Fourth Reich. And so you don't leave the euro. Nobody leaves the euro. In 2012, Rubini and Stiglitz and Krugman were running around with their hair on fire saying, Greece is getting kicked out and Spain should quit and go back to the peseta and devalue and lower their unit labor costs, et cetera. And I said, no. So nobody's leaving. They're going to add members. They've added 3 new members. The next member will be Scotland. They'll be coming in probably in the next year or so. But you don't get out of the euro. So the euro will hang together, notwithstanding this kind of stress.
Okay, next question.
Hello, my name's Ian Munson.
Yeah, sorry.
In terms of reorganising the global monetary system, what do you believe is the role that China will be taking, and what influence do you believe it will have on the solution?
China has cast its lot with the SDR. And that's what the, October 1st, 2016, is this past October, the Chinese yuan was included among the 5 currencies that are references for the SDR. By the way, the SDR isn't backed by anything. People think there's this big vault full of hard currency at the IMF to back up these SDRs. They're not.
By the American taxpayers.
With printed money, if it comes to that, which is highly inflationary, which is good for gold. So, China's doing 2 things at once. First of all, they've joined the SDR. The Chinese yuan did not meet any of the IMF's criteria for global reserve currency, but the IMF bent the rules because they wanted China in that club, the world's most exclusive club, 5 members. In the 60s in the U.S., we had an expression, you're either on the bus or off the bus. Well, now China's on the bus as far as the SDRs are concerned. But the other thing they're doing, they have $2 trillion of dollar-denominated securities, mostly Treasury securities, in their reserve position. The dollar has no greater friend than China because they're hoping that we don't devalue those dollars. But we always do. I don't think we'll get that far. The collapse will come first. But the U.S. effort is just inflation. So here's your $1 trillion back. Good luck buying a loaf of bread. So China's vulnerable to that. So what China's been doing, they've bought 4,000 or 5,000 tons of gold. And they lie about it. They're completely non-transparent. They keep it off the books. It's safe. But there's good data from mining and Hong Kong imports, et cetera. I'll defer to my friend Ronnie Staffelli here because Ronnie knows more about gold than anyone. But they've got 4,000 or 5,000 tons of gold. So what they're doing, they're creating a hedge position. So if the U.S. inflates the dollar and makes those secure, because they can't dump them. I mean, they cannot dump them. It's just too much to move. So if we don't have inflation and those securities retain their real value, the gold won't do much. But if we get inflation and those securities lose the value, the gold will go up. So they've created this hedge position. So they're doing 2 things. They're using gold to hedge their dollar exposure, and they're joining the SDR, which they expect will be the end game.
The thing is, as I said in my presentation, first thing that's going to happen is China's becoming more authoritarian under its new president, and they'll just centralize even more. They have great military, and the Communist Party is going to maintain control. But the point is that they are going to have a problem, and they're going to have a surplus of goods and services, and they're going to dump them on the rest of us. So I think that Jim would rather like inflation to raise its ugly head, because that will affect the price of gold. But I fear the very, very opposite. I fear that this dumping, this flood of goods that are going to come not just from China but Brazil and Malaysia and all those places are incredibly productive and got loads of stuff they've been making for us, is going to be dumped on the global economy, and we're going to have deflation. And that gold is just going to, is it going to increase in value? I don't know, but I'm not an expert on that. But I fear that it's going to be a very, very messy thing. Because they're going to have to, at the moment they've got a glut of rubber tyres, for example, because the Americans have stopped buying rubber tyres in the quantity that China expected them to do. So those gluts are now going to be dumped on the global markets and going to deflate the economy even further.
I agree.
There's no management of flows of stuff either. So there's no management of the flows of capital, and there's no management of flows of trade. These are all left to something called the invisible hand.
I agree and disagree with that. I agree with Anne completely that the natural state of the world is deflationary. There's no question, because of capacity, because of demographics, because of technology, because of debt and deleveraging, a lot of things. The natural state, the world wants to deflate. I agree with that completely, and that would take gold to $500, although it might actually be more valuable in real terms. That's a nominal adjustment. But central banks cannot permit deflation. And we don't have time, but I could spend an hour explaining why they can't. Deflation destroys tax collections. They have not figured out how to tax the increase in the standard of living if your costs are lower. They don't know how to tax that, so they can't allow it, and makes the real value of debt go up, and the debt will default. So understand the global financial system as two tectonic plates. Here's natural deflation for the reasons Anne mentioned, and policy-induced inflation. And right now they're kind of fighting each other to a standstill, but that is dynamically unstable. That's going to snap. Could snap either way, but it has to end in deflation. It has to, because if it doesn't, all this debt's going to default. It'll be far worse than the Great Depression, and maybe that's where we end. I can't rule that out. I'm certainly looking for it. I might like my $500 gold better than my $5,000 gold, and the reason is that the world of 500, because see, nothing moves in isolation. If gold goes to 500, the Dow's at 100. The S&P's at 20. I mean,
And the dollar?
The dollar is no longer legal tender because
right.
because we've lost confidence.
Okay, we've got time for
as in India.
one more quick question, and we should get it from this
Can
side
we
of the
have a
room.
woman?
Yeah, there's one.
Yeah.
It's a lady in the front row.
My name's Denise Gudimas. Can you describe to us, paint a picture for us for what the end game is? And is part of that end game going to be when central banks have lost control? And therefore, you have to start to ask yourself now, the Federal Reserve in the next few weeks will be looking to raise by 25 basis points, when in fact, we have the 10-year US Treasury now trading at almost 2.5%.
Yeah.
And has the Fed lost control at this point, and are we entering the end game?
Yeah, I think the Fed has lost control, but anyway, it never wanted control, and it gave it up. The central banks gave up their powers over the rate of interest and yields over these periods of time, which which prior to, in the 45-70 period, they were managing. But they gave up control, and now, I'm horrified by what's happening in the bond markets because of this global overhang of debt, and private debt as well. It's just going to ratchet up that debt, and that then there'll be defaults, and it's all going to be. I think Jim's can paint a better picture for you than I can, but I find it really frightening. I don't think that the Fed should raise rates in December because I don't think the economy is up to it. But I notice.
Is it relevant anymore?
Well, exactly. I noticed that, all four central banks are pumping out something like $500 billion a month to keep the thing from deflating. And still they have failed to do it, And still the inflationists are deeply disappointed because we haven't got inflation. And they come back to, it's not up to the central banks. It's up to economic activity. We don't have enough employment, we don't have enough income, we don't have all those things which is what makes an economy healthy and which makes banks healthy, which makes central banks function. So because we've left everything to nature, to the invisible hand, we don't have enough of those economic benefits which would actually enable. And the central banks have been screaming for fiscal policy, you know, screaming. You never hear central bankers speaking in such strong terms about the need. And the politicians are so ideologically, you know, the people like Schäuble, so ideologically committed to not doing anything, but allowing the patient to starve to death, you know. And then, of course, the central banks can't do anything. So it's about our aeroplane. We're flying on one engine, which is called monetary policy. And these guys have been, I would like to argue, heroic in keeping the plane afloat. But they've switched off the fiscal engine. And you can't run an economy without both, especially when there's... Well, he says he will, and that's why everybody's excited, and that's why the dollar's gone through the roof and the gold has fallen, as far as I can see, Jim. You know, so Mr. Trump's not very good for the gold price, as far as I can tell. But anyway...
He will be.
I love it.
Jim,
We're out of time. We're out of time, so I'll answer Denise's question very briefly. The Fed has lost control, but they just don't know it, and that's the most dangerous place you can be.
So we have a very quick local one, just getting you
Yeah.
to London, and then and this has been a big year for this country with the Brexit vote, and I just wondered where you saw our prospects as a country and our relationship with Europe, just in a 2 to 5 year schedule.
I thought that there were two sensible paths for the UK. One is stay in the EU and adopt the euro, just join the club, or quit the EU and buy gold. But they haven't done either. They've chosen to quit the EU and not buy gold, and that leaves them extremely vulnerable. So I would see sterling going to, well below $1. But Anne made the point earlier. She said, this whole Euro thing, ECB thing doesn't make sense, et cetera. They do have one thing that holds the whole thing together that is a source of strength. The members collectively have 10,000 tons of gold. That's more than the United States. That's the largest single sovereign holding of gold. So they actually do have a lifeline. The UK, unfortunately, doesn't have any relative to the size of its economy. That's why Scotland will join the euro, because Bank of England won't give the Royal Bank of Scotland the Bank of Scotland any gold when Scotland leaves the UK.
My answer is you can't eat gold.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we have a big round of applause for all of our speakers tonight?
Thank you very much.
And can I just say as well, I've sat in on quite a few of these things, as I'm sure many of us have, and that was probably the best audience Q&A I've ever seen. They were very good questions, and I was really pleased to see people ask some of the questions that I'd written down and didn't have a chance to ask myself. So thanks very much for that. I was also quite surprised that I think my big takeaway from this is that there was a lot more areas of agreement than I thought there would be, which on one level is quite heartening on a human level, but when you consider what those areas of agreement were, it's quite concerning. I mean, basically, the banking system is too big, it's very unwieldy, it's looking incredibly dangerous, and nothing will be done. And I think that's the one message I'll be taking out of this, and which, though that's the evidence we're faced with. But Jim, I know you're going to be signing copies of The Road to Ruin immediately after this. Is that out in the foyer?
Right on the foyer, yes.
Right out in the foyer. And there are copies available?
And I'm publishing a book in February 2017.
Yes.
And is it available for pre-order right now? Is it available for pre-order right now?
I think it might be.
You got to check Amazon. You got to sell those books, Anne.
The Production of Money.
It's called The Production of Money, yeah.
What's the subtitles about?
The elastic production of money.
The subtitles about, I had it written down.
How to get back control of the banking.
That's right, yes.
Bankers.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
How to wrest it back from bankers, that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Will you take an ounce of gold if I buy a book from you?
An ounce of gold?
No, it says it's got money, so I'm sure she won't take it then.
Just do a gram. A gram is about the right amount.
A gram's still worth a decent amount.
It is $50, right?
Oh, that, yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much for coming, and safe journey home. Thank you.